Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one of the things that Christians do, people who follow Jesus, do is engage in spiritual disciplines. But the common understanding of spiritual disciplines is that it is an activity that takes us outside of the world. We go and leave the world to pray, fast, have Bible studies, solitude. But we don't think of engagement in the world as actually part of our spiritual disciplines. And certainly we tend not to think of engagement in the political world as a spiritual discipline. And yet, that is exactly the point of our guest for today, Michael Weir. Michael Weir is the founder, president, and CEO of the Center for Christianity and Public Life. And for more than a decade, he's served as a trusted advisor on matters of faith and public life, including serving in the Obama White House and presidential campaign. And so I am thrilled that Michael is here to talk about that in conjunction with his new book, The Spirit of Our Politics, Spiritual Formation, and the Renovation of Public Life. Michael, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
So good to be with you, Curtis. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's been fun because I've been in conversation with Michael over the last several years on this intersection of faith and political life. And Michael, you're advancing a new paradigm here to think about political life, political engagement integrated with spiritual disciplines. Tell us how you arrived at this paradigm.
Yeah, so part of it is just, how my understanding has developed working in politics and seeing it sort of up close. Sometimes I feel like it's those who are furthest away from participation in our political life, like actual political participation, who feel like, oh, what could spirituality have to do with politics? Politics is sort of corrupt, and it's all about sort of raw assertions of power, and sort of it's this other world. And as you sort of indicated in your introduction, spiritual formation is for our quiet times when we're able to go on retreat and rent a cabin in the woods. And so what could those two things have to do with one another? And instead, like, what I found is, in politics, people are as deeply, profoundly human as anywhere else. The decisions and the interactions and the way the political processes involve human beings that have a certain shape to their character. So spiritual formation is just the process by which our character takes on a certain shape or form. And so from that, just from experience, I've seen how important spiritual formation has been in our political life through my own experience and through sort of seeing and working with others. I'd also say spiritual formation is essentially about and for the whole of our lives. Mm-hmm. And we are there are social and political aspects of our lives that if we are not thinking about our formation in those contexts, then whole life discipleship or whole life formation is simply incoherent. It's impossible. We're undermining it at the very foundation. And so both as a matter of what our politics is, and then as a matter of what spiritual formation is, it's essential to think of the two together.
So you're talking really about a two-way street here between spiritual formation and politics, that our spiritual formation should influence our politics, that we should be trying to bring our spirituality into politics, but also we need to be cognizant of the way politics may be spiritually forming us, right? This is a two-way street that you're trying to kind of shed some street lamps on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think the kind of people we are has much to do with the kind of the kind of politics and public life that we have.
Yeah.
But as you said, it's a two-way street. Our politics is shaping us. It's shaping the lives of our churches, our communities. I think that's become more apparent to a lot of folks than ever. that this sort of idea that politics is sort of out there and we go to politics to sort of get what we think we need, but then we sort of can come back, retreat to our own sort of private lives, sort of unscathed or untouched. It doesn't work that way. Politics produces culture, and that culture is pervasive, and it shapes our imaginations.
Well, let's talk about this at the individual level, drawing on your life, Michael. So, give us a picture and of this sort of flow of traffic from politics to spiritual formation in your own life. So, I want you to describe what your spiritual life would have been like, how you were formed spiritually before you entered the White House, and then when you left the White House, how were you different spiritually? Give us the before and after picture and how your political life actually formed you spiritually.
Oh, I love that question, Curtis. So I became a Christian when I was 15 after reading Romans. A lot of other things happened, but the sort of precipitating event was I was handed a tract of Romans, and it changed my life.
I can't believe that you are a proof point that handing out tracts is an effective form of evangelism. That's amazing.
It is a great encouragement to many pastors and ministries to know that it's not in vain.
I repent of my cynicism and skepticism of tract handing out. You are a rebuke to me, Michael, for that cynicism. So, but go ahead. Okay, so this is at 15. You get a tract on Romans. You read Romans. You become a Christian. Keep telling this fascinating story going forward.
So I was already interested in civics. I become a Christian, and I think, well, I need to go to seminary and become a pastor. And thankfully, a pastor in my life said, Michael, look around. There are Christians who aren't pastors. And so, like, at the very early sort of early stages of my coming to faith was this idea that, following Jesus is not just about sort of the strictly sort of theological, or I go to church now and so I'm a Christian. It's no, this is about the whole of life. And again, after a period in which I thought, I just want to do the most Christian thing I could think of, go to seminary, become a pastor. This vocational question of what does it mean to be faithful in and with public things has been the vocational question that's grounded and guided my life. That led me to DC, where I went to college, and it was only about a year and a half into that I ended up working on a presidential campaign, and then the White House. I thought the White House was going to be really just like working in an intense job like that. I thought it was going to be a great harm to my spiritual life. I thought, I thought, I'm not going to have time or space to for practices, for disciplines. Instead, what I found was the structure, the fact that I had days that were very full, meant that, like, on my metro ride to the office in the morning, I knew if I wasn't reading scripture on that metro ride there, unlike when I was in college, there wasn't going to be like a 2-hour gap between classes where I was going to be able to do that. The other amazing thing about the job I had in the White House was I was in the Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships, where I got to work with, among others, Christian leaders and ministries every day. I don't think I've ever been prayed for as much as the 3.5 years when I was in the White House. And so prayer, scripture reading, service, the discipline of service, the structure I had around my worship life, again, because my days were so compact, it was like especially important that I was there on Sunday morning, a part of a local church that was not centered around politics, but around Jesus. and so I had it was a time of spiritual flourishing for me,
Yeah.
not sort of depletion, and there's so much more to say. I think, to speak sort of directly to the politics, um, you understand, and you don't have to work in the White House to do this. You don't have to even have a political, just by actually participating in politics, as opposed to just consuming political entertainment, which is what a lot of people do, and they think they're doing politics when they do that. Um, but political participation will acquaint you, um, with the fallibility of human beings, with the fallibility of political instruments to sort of finally solve the most pressing challenges we have. That's not to say that politics doesn't make a difference. It's very important, but you understand how imperfect some of the tools that we have. And so there's people think those who are most involved politically have the uh, are the most ideological, the least humble about politics. I found uh, completely the opposite. It's actually those who were on the sidelines, who sort of thought that they were above or outside of politics, who struggled with ideas like, "Oh, those bums! If only they do what I know should be done, everything would solve itself."
Mm.
Those who are actually involved in some of the issues that our politics deals with knows, "Oh no, these are intractable issues for a reason. There,
Yeah.
there's a lot to wrestle with here." Yeah.
Yeah. So, Michael, it sounds like, again, talking about this directional flow from politics to spiritual formation, your experience as being involved in politics at a very high level, at a national level, you actually found politics to be a context for spiritual formation because you were praying as you were engaging in this work. You were getting prayed for. You were feeling the need for worship as you were feeling under the time, the compactness of political life. I see that. You also bring up a really interesting point that politics, being involved in politics, gave you a window into kind of the deeper truths of spiritual formation. Namely, I think what you're saying is like our fallibility, our limitedness, our contingency, our need
Yeah.
for God to be the ultimate answer, because our human answers fall so short. We fall short of the glory of God. If we want to
Yeah.
draw back to your Romans tract,
Yeah.
um, right? So that makes sense, and I can intuit that for you working in the White House.
Yeah.
But I want you to say a little bit more for somebody who is like the average listener who's not working in the
Yeah.
White House or even as a professional politician.
Yes.
I do really like your idea that, what you're talking about here is not consuming politics as entertainment, but actually engagement in politics. So describe how can the average listener to the Good Faith podcast actually not just consume politics, but actually engage in politics, and engage in politics as a context for spiritual formation. What could that look like?
Oh gosh. But again, a lovely, lovely question. It's uh, uh, it can look like a number of things. It can look like, is there an issue that, because of your expertise, your experiences, the particular needs of your community, you feel drawn and called to participating in more deeply?
Mm,
And what that can look like is, obviously, study can be a part of it, tactile experience with the issue. So, whether it's, gosh, my church has uh, an immigration legal aid ministry that you can volunteer at, and you could learn from one point of view, one sort of entry point into our immigration system. Just from volunteering at that ministry, you can understand the nature of our immigration, come to a greater understanding of the nature of our immigration laws, uh, the the challenges that immigrants face, the particular the personal experiences that they bring with them. You could think from the government side, because if you're involved in legal aid, you're actually working within a policy and legal structure. You learn why certain kinds of procedures are in place, and you get to put yourself in the place of the government, of law enforcement, of thinking it's not just it's not just sort of some opaque theory, but you start to understand, oh, this policy is in place because they're trying to prevent sort of this from happening, or they're trying to channel things in a particular direction. You could take that with education. You could take that with the way that trash is collected in your neighborhood. So you can participate in the you can study, you can learn the ways in which decisions are made pertaining to the issue, and do things like organize little groups of friends to learn and contact a local official on an issue. You can work through your church or a local nonprofit to host learning groups or host town hall meetings where you can bring experts to explore an issue. So there are a whole range of ways in which we can directly participate in the political process, as opposed to being what the political scientist Eitan Hirsch out at Tufts calls a political hobbyist. And this is a really helpful term that Hirsch developed. And this basically refers to kind of person who would, if you ask them, like, are you burnt out by politics? They'd say yes. You'd ask them, well, what does politics look like in your life? And they might say, well, I'm on the Reddit channels, 3 hours, 4 hours a day, or I'm consuming, watch the Daily Show every night, and I'm just like really exhausted by everything that's happening in DC. And they're, as Hirsch would say, but what they're not doing is they're not actually involved in the process of building power for self-governance. And that's that's a problem in my view. To expend that level of energy on political entertainment without ever actually participating in the political process.
Michael, what you're saying makes me think a lot about these two core spiritual values that we advance in the After Party project that I'm leading with David French and Russell Moore. And you've heard me talk about this before, but the two great spiritual values we believe that Jesus is advancing, among many, but two that we really call out, is hope and humility. Hope and humility as what God wants to form deeply in every disciple. Hope and humility. And it strikes me as I'm hearing you talk that politics can have the opportunity to actually foster deep hope and deep humility, but done wrongly, it can actually deform, it can actually curtail our hope and humility. And I love what you're talking about as the difference between a political hobbyist or a political consumer versus somebody who's actually engaged in politics as a spiritual discipline. Because it seems to me, if I could paraphrase what you're saying, somebody who's just consuming news as a hobbyist from a Reddit or online channel or social media links that you follow through, there's very little hope. Like everything, so much of that flow of information is about despair, anger, disgust, hopelessness. That's, I would say, is like 90% of the content you consume as a hobbyist, right? And there's very little humility because everybody is saying, declaring with absolute certainty their take is right. And so it just seems like if your engagement with politics is primarily in consuming news, you're going to get deformed in terms of hope and humility. But what you're saying is if you actually get your hands dirty and get involved, like say in local politics, you have an opportunity to do something, to actually say, hey, we can actually improve this. And therefore, kind of actually build your hope. But also you're going to get humbled, right? Like you're going to also realize, I love what you just said, when you realize, oh, this thing actually connects to this thing, or this thing that we thought was wrong was actually in response to try to correct this previous wrong. I talk about this all the time in my own consulting practice, that when I'm brought in to solve a problem in an organization, 9 times out of 10, that problem was a solution to a previous problem,
Right.
right? And it seems like
Exactly.
politics is you
Yeah.
encounter this dynamic a lot. Like the thing that you're so angry and protesting about is horrible. Well, that was actually put in place to solve a previous problem, and
Yeah.
so it's deeply humbling about our limitations to actually solve problems by human means, short of Jesus' return to make all
Yeah.
things right. Is this kind of what you're talking about?
So I do think my first book was on, it was more of a historical sort of narrative of the Obama years and my sort of experience in them. It was a book called Reclaiming Hope. And I talk about hope and humility in that book. I do think that politics, I think life has this potential.
Yeah,
It's what is the orientation of your heart,
yeah,
and what are the practices that you're taking up to cultivate these, if you want to call them
yeah.
virtues. I do think, right, the point is not that we need to cultivate greater hope in politics,
That's right.
or
Yeah,
that or that um, you know, we the Christian perspective is to just always think our political process is going to work out for good. That's not it. It's actually, when our hope is rightly placed, it actually opens up a vision for the possibilities in all of life. So
right.
it's not about a hope in politics. It's that when your hope is in Jesus, you can engage in all of life with
Yeah.
a sense of possibility
Yes.
that God might have something for me, for us in this circumstance.
Well,
That,
and
like,
then we
this
yeah,
can
and we
be,
can engage in politics as a sign, right? Like as a
yes,
signpost pointing to Jesus, not as the destination, not as the
correct.
actual thing that will solve, but actually as a pointer. Yeah.
Yes. Uh, Politics is an essential form in which we can love our neighbor. It's not the most important, it's not the only,
Yeah.
but what I think is so important is that we move away from, I think the dominant views of Christianity, when it comes to politics, is that Christianity is either something that is useless or something to be used.
Mm,
Christianity is either something that is above our politics, or our politics is either something that's above the gospel or outside and irrelevant to the gospel.
yeah.
What we need to do is rightly situate politics as under and within a bigger vision of what God is doing in the world, in which, like all of our lives, we're called to be faithful. We're called to place our activity, as I write in the new book, under the jurisdiction of love, the will to good. And when we do that in politics, as in any other area of life, when we're learning from Jesus how to do that, that's where spiritual formation can take place.
And Michael, we've been talking about, like, in some ways, the ideal, like that. I think the biblical ideal of how engaging in political life can helpfully form us spiritually, say, especially like we've been talking about in the virtues of hope and humility. But let's talk about what's been happening in recent years in reality, which is a far uglier picture than that ideal, which is that actually on both the left and the right, that our politics is deforming us spiritually, that it's not forming hope and humility, but forming the exact opposite of despair and arrogance. And I think this is happening on both on the left and the right. It's important to call this out as a bipartisan deformation that's happening. Certainly, like in our curriculum in the after party, we have this story of a very liberal, progressive person who has gotten sort of so kind of absorbed in her progressive politics that she acted really meanly towards David and Nancy French, and the curriculum tells a story of how that was redeemed, but it was redeemed out of something fairly ugly. I think I feel so bad for the Frenches, for Nancy French in particular, because she just kind of takes this deformation from both sides, like in the story that's in our curriculum. It's from the left, but she's also experienced it terribly from the right. She had this awful experience recently. She's as many listeners know, she is going through chemo right now for breast cancer. And she recently told me this story where she was at her chemo center getting chemo, and she sees this woman by herself who has just received diagnosis of breast cancer. And she's crying, she's weeping, this other person. Clearly, she's alone. And so Nancy goes up to her out of compassion and just tries to comfort her, and finds out that she's divorced, her friend kind of alienated from her kids, and she's just hearing this diagnosis kind of alone. And so Nancy reaches out and says, "Let me be your cancer buddy. We can exchange information. We'll text." And she does this for a while, and finally she gets a text one day that's like, I'm from this other woman saying, "I'm just breaking down. I can't hold it together." And Nancy says, "Let's get together. Let's have dinner, and we can talk more." So they do that, and then Nancy arrives at this dinner, and it turns out that this woman, in between her exchange of texts and this dinner, has finally Googled Nancy French and found out who she was, and found out that she's married to David French. They're both never Trumpers. And this woman proceeds to just lay into Nancy in a very hostile way, condemning and critiquing her politics. And Nancy's just sitting there flabbergasted, taking this in. And when I heard this story, I thought, oh my gosh, that is a picture of how deformed how politics has so deformed us, that this woman who is needing comfort, needing love, and is actually getting it from Nancy, who herself is a breast, suffering from the same ailment, and trying to reach out to this woman with solidarity, would actually cling to her political partisan hatreds more than to actually receive love from a fellow sufferer of a shared disease. I thought, oh my gosh, this is how deformed it is. Now, I'm telling the story in some detail, and it's a story of this as somebody who is, coming from the right. But I also, I believe this kind of way in which political hatreds of partisan divides have deformed us so deeply spiritual. It really is bipartisan. It's not just restricted to people on the right. And so, Michael, I wanted to ask you, as somebody who is a figure who knows the progressive world, you come from that world as a person of faith. Can you depict how you see this deformation happening on the progressive side?
Yeah, right. And Nancy and David are both friends. But part of what's interesting about their stories, and they've spoken to this some, is uh, uh, sort of the the ways in which they sort of contributed in various ways to that kind of deformation in various stages and in different sort of aspects of their lives. And so, right. So I think it goes to your point, like this is part of the culture. On the left, so let me take a step back. So in the book, I talk about uh, the fixer gospel and the toolbox gospel. The And I think one of the helpful things I hope readers get reading through this section in particular is, while I'm talking about two sort of different adaptations, at the end they're basically the same thing. And I think that's one of the most striking things for sort of folks who have been deformed or malformed on the right. The thing that is hardest for them to see, but most jarring, is to see the ways in which the left is not some is the ways in which they're similar, sort of like the horseshoe theory. Like, they come from different sides, but they both end up in the place where there's a privileging, a moralization of their political views to an extent that it's elevated to a kind of religious dogma, a sort of perspective of good versus evil. And so so I do think that happens on the left. What it T.S. Eliot has this line. He says, the great human endeavor has been to try to create a system so perfect that people no longer have to be good. And there are sort of expressions, ways in which this plays out on the right. I do think that this is a particular sort of a technocratic impulse on the left, which suggests that all sort of human fallibility is a result of not having the right policies in place. If just we if we were just able to if the left was just able, and again, this isn't the whole left, just like issues on the right are not everyone on the right, but like there is a permutation of this view that if only we could implement our policies in exactly the way we envision, then everything would be solved. And there's a profound overconfidence that has the potential to warp the soul, but then also the public implications of that are, if you think that you're just a suite of legislation away from a utopian society, what can you justify on your way to that ideal? If it's just within your grasp, and the only thing that's in the way is just the political opposition that just doesn't get it, then how do you view the political opposition? Why would they oppose justice, equity? So right, all of a sudden we synonymize, we make equivalent our ultimate view, these ultimate sort of principles: justice, equity, the dignity of the human person, into policy instruments, so that we baptize and make gods of our policy instruments, and so that anyone who opposes them, they're not just opposing our policy approach, they're not just opposing our political point of view, that they're opposing these sort of ultimate principles. Again, that happens on the right and the left, but I do think there's a particular permutation that I think folks will find familiar, just in their experience of hearing some folks on the left talk.
And Michael, it seems like that initiates then a vicious cycle, right? As opposed to a virtuous cycle. It's a vicious cycle because, the right, people on the conservative side, they're not stupid. They perceive reality. They perceive the truth, that I've got this political opponent that is arrogating for themselves all moral truth in a really arrogant way, and then are going to pair that with the claim to power, and then therefore going to shove down my throat their vision of truth and reality, which is not my vision of truth and justice, especially on certain issues, right? On the issues that, especially on sexuality and gender, they feel especially like, wait a minute, you are cramming down my throat and claiming all like privilege for claims to truth, and calling me, all these names because I don't subscribe to your vision of truth in terms of, again, I would say especially gender, sexuality, and things like that, which feel very, especially like threatening to those on the right. And then therefore, then they say, well, if that's the game, then I'm going to ramp up my power play. And now we've got this Nietzschean, war against all, Nietzschean Hobbesian war of all against all. How do we break this cycle, Michael? And how does spiritual formation, how can it break the cycle? And I want you to especially speak to your tribe on this. Like, what's your message to those on the progressive who are prone to this move, to this power move? How can you persuade, convince, entice them to drop the power play and instead seek the spiritual formation towards hope and humility, as we've been talking about? What's the message? What's the move?
Oh yeah, gosh. Well, I'm not sure I'm the person to speak to progressives. I don't count that as my tribe. But what I would say is there are a few things I talk about in the chapter. There's a chapter in The Spirit of Our Politics in which I advance a range of spiritual practices, some sort of the old, tried and true, again, silence, solitude, study, worship, celebration, confession, service, secrecy, or what I refer to as anonymous service, um, the fasting. These are all spiritual practices that have profound political implications. I think silence and solitude, in particular, and I think silence and solitude for exactly the reason you just said, which is that we are bombarded with these depictions of who it is that we're supposed to oppose and who
Mm,
stands in our way. Silence and solitude have the um, capacity of um, of uh, uh, giving ourselves space and giving God space to work such that our identity will not be centered in these narratives of opposition and antagonism that are constructed for political purposes. So, right, like what we just said about the left and the right, there are certainly instances of sort of the ideal or the unideal sort of case. Um, we live in a country of hundreds of millions of people. Like both the left and the right are not constituted of these like pure Nietzschean sort of mentalities. So we can, but silence and solitude are disciplines that can help us to understand um, that uh, the lines of division are not quite uh, as clear and stark as what our politics wants to suggest.
thank you. Yeah,
Also,
wonderful.
also in that chapter, I talk about sort of 21st century spiritual disciplines
Mm,
for public life. And I talk a great deal about news consumption, how we approach the news, what kind of news we're reading, what we're looking for when we're consuming news. I talk about breaking groupthink.
mhm.
This is not about sort of being the annoying sort of devil's advocate in your group. It is about um, there's a real danger in um, we don't have to get into all the social science here, but I think I've heard you speak on this podcast before about sort of the idea of the big sort, and we're segregating ourselves ideologically. Um, there's a real danger in forming social communities around these sort of prudential political truths, so that they just keep on getting reaffirmed, and the narratives of how right we are and how wrong those who oppose us. So how can we put ourselves in the place of those who would disagree with us in a way that might improve our own position? We might be able to tailor it to address and mitigate some of the concerns others have. We also just might come to understand how fallible and sort of how imperfect sort of political solutions are generally. And so there's a range of these kinds of disciplines, but they are um, uh, we need to be aware of the environment, the political environment we're in, understand the kinds of stories that political parties and political actors are telling us, which make things very simple for them, even if they aren't reflective of reality. And then we can be cognizant of how we're pushing back against some of those impulses, and providing to our politicians and parties a different kind of incentive structure.
I love that picture of us becoming different people so that that actually becomes like leaven that works into the bread of politics. And it's so true. You write about this in the book that really in many ways we're getting the politics we deserve. We're getting the politics we want. And so until we ourselves change such that we want hope, we want humility, and we don't want despair and fear, we don't want arrogance, until we change ourselves, we're going to just keep getting the politics that actually reflects the state of our soul. um, and this brings up Dallas Willard, because you bring in Dallas Willard, a key figure for you in the book, in which Dallas Willard, a key part of what he's saying is the spiritual formation. Certainly, these all these practices, these disciplines, it's certainly for us. It's certainly for us as individuals in our private lives. It is for us, but it's not just for us. That Willard's great contribution is to say, no, we are being formed so that we can be part of a vanguard of Jesus's
Mm.
kingdom breaking into the world, because we have been formed differently. So I want you to expand on that, on this sort of how, how you're integrating this Dallas Willard, this great spiritual thinker, into the realm of politics. Say more about, why you brought Willard into this.
Yeah. So Dallas has just had a profound impact in my life. I was given in my first months in the White House, I was given a copy of The Divine Conspiracy, and I read it, and it was like a second spiritual awakening in my life. And Dallas, for those who aren't familiar with Dallas, Dallas he passed 11 years ago now. About he was a philosopher. He taught at the University of Southern California for a time. He was chair of the philosophy department there. He also had this other career outside of sort of mainstream, quote unquote, secular academia. He had a lot to say about the idea of the notion of a secular academia. But in addition to his role at a state school in California, he was a Christian author and teacher. He was a pastor for a time. He taught Sunday school for a time, and he wrote these wonderful books, including The Divine Conspiracy, Spirit of the Disciplines, Renovation of the Heart. And Willard described Jesus's gospel as an announcement of the present availability of the kingdom. That to be a Christian, to be a disciple, is to learn through interactive relationship with Jesus how he would live your life if he were you. And it is Willard had a vision for spiritual formation, or had a framework for spiritual formation he called VIM, Vision, Intention, Means. I believe that's how he wrote all of his books. It's how I wrote this book with VIM in mind. He's been a profound influence. As folks pick up The Spirit of Our Politics and read the book, they'll see it's not. It's pretty clear that Willard is this profound through line through the work. In one way, this book is an attempt to is applying Willard's ideas to our politics and public life. I think one of the ways in which that is powerful, and one of the reasons I decided to write this book, is that I think Willard is someone who was active and teaching and was a Christian leader during the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, who never took his eye off the ball. I think people who are familiar with Willard will be surprised will see with new eyes the social implications of Willard's writings. But Willard is not someone who sort of was drawn in unhelpful ways into partisan politics. He is not someone whose sort of career was sort of tainted by scandal.
Yeah.
And I think for young people in particular, this idea that you can be a faithful Christian who's pursuing life with the Lord, and also have a vibrant career in some ways a cosmopolitan environment, that you could be very clear about your commitment to Jesus and advance that in profound ways, while also not being a jerk, is a profound testimony. When we have other we have examples to the contrary. And I think young people, but really I think all of us, Curtis, are looking for, like, does anyone really believe this stuff?
That's right.
Or is it all just a power play? Is it all just an identitarian sort of assertion? And Willard's teaching in his life, he wasn't perfect by any means, and he would be the last person who'd sort of want sort of devotees or anything like that. And that's sort of not what I am. I do have profound appreciation for the ways in which his approach helps me see Jesus more clearly.
Yeah, I think when we go back to that image we had of a two-way street between politics and spiritual formation, I think of Dallas Willard like as a traffic guide guiding this two-way traffic. And in particular, I think in underappreciated ways that he's really a traffic guide trying to direct spiritual formation into the world, into the
Yes.
and what I think your book does beautifully is it carries up that mantle and particularly directs that traffic from spiritual formation into the political world. But I really encourage folks, listeners, if you're not familiar with the work of Dallas Willard, to pick up his work directly. Divine Conspiracy is a great place to start, and read them in tandem. Divine Conspiracy by Dallas Willard and Spirit of Politics by Michael Weir. So, Michael, to wrap up here, I want to ask, how has that traffic been for you most recently? Like these days, today, let's start with hope. What is growing your sense of hope?
Yeah, I think what is growing my sense of hope is the level of earnestness and a commitment to um, a commitment to what is real among young people in particular. I think that we're in this really incredible moment, both incredibly, difficult in some ways, but also full of opportunity and possibility of, um, profound disappointment opens up a pathway towards um, a deeper rooted hope. And I think we've been through a period of profound disappointment, and so there's great opportunity in that, and I see that when I'm on Christian college campuses and when I'm talking with not just young Christians, but there is something really special going on among I think next generation Christians who are asking really earnest questions, and earnest questions that the Lord can handle those. Yeah.
Yeah, I really echo that. I think that the Spirit of God is stirring something in this next generation. I think that's exactly right. I think the Asbury revival is a little pointed note of that. But that more broadly than that, I think I see that also among all the young people that I speak to on college campuses, both secular and Christian campuses. So hearty amen to that. Michael, what's growing your humility these days?
Yeah, something you care about a great deal, Curtis, which is institution building. It's I'm so excited and so encouraged by the work at the Center for Christianity and Public Life, and it's just an honor to be involved there. But kind of to the beginning of our conversation, and I think this, you've experienced this. I mean, we've partnered together over the years, and we've sort of been able to strike each other's stories. Like, there's a reason why people go for platform over institution building, and it's because platforms are places of assertion and control and performance, and institutions sort of have a way of breaking through and breaking down all of that. And so you just learn all of the things that you don't know, that you're not equipped for, that you can't do, and that hasn't for me yet been a despairing it's actually been a hopeful process,
but also humbling,
but
right?
also
Yeah.
but also yeah, the operationalization of an
That's
ideal is very different from the ideal. Yeah.
That's right. And just, boy, if there's anything that you want to, um, and this is actually a discipline. This is a discipline of humbling. This is, I think, like management, like manage people. I try to manage people really well, and that is a deeply humbling experience. It's also hopeful in terms of you seeing people grow. But I constantly humbled by my inadequacies, my inability to understand people well, and then you realize, oh, right, I could have done this better. And
Yeah.
without slipping into despair or self-critique, you do get humbled as a manager. And it is where, again, institution building and spiritual formation go hand in hand. I love that answer, Michael. Well, Michael, thank you so much for being part of this conversation. Listeners, I encourage you to get Spirit of Politics by Michael Weir, how spiritual formation and the renovation of public life go hand in hand. Michael, thank you for joining us here on the Good Faith Podcast.
So good to be with you. Thank you, Curtis.
And listeners, we invite you once again next week to join us for these great conversations that we have when we gather around the campfire.